Article on the subject has engendered a furious response. But I think what's interesting about the point that she was making was that, is that our culture and our universities in general tend to basically tell young adults, both women and men, in a sense, and Wheatley is, I think, an exception, but certainly UVA, the sort of the basic idea is that you should really be focusing for the next, 5 or 10 years on your work and on your education. That those are the most important things for you. And yet, if we look at kind of what predicts, meaning, purpose, and happiness, it's our most fundamental relationships with other people. Our friendships, and especially our marriages. And so she was kind of making that point and saying that you should use your time at college as an opportunity to kind of take that college time as a springboard into your future family life as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming in for this presentation. My name's Annie Groh, and I actually graduated about 2 years ago. And I was just wondering, I noticed that when you were talking about the benefits of marrying young, you mainly use statistics of women. And I was wondering if that's because on average women, seem to marry younger, or if it was for simplicity's sake of the presentation, or if it's because you find that women do benefit more than men for marrying young.
It was basically for simplicity's sake, but I think it's important to come back to 2 slides, I think, here that are specifically, reporting on the associations between age at marriage for men. Here you can see that men who get married in their 20s are more likely to pull in a decent wage in their mid-30s, compared to those who get married in their 30s, and especially those who don't get married at all. So there's a broader literature that suggests that when men get married, they tend to become more responsible, they work longer hours, they work more strategically, and they earn more money. Now, in the strategic point, what we've seen, for instance, is that men who are married are more likely to keep job A if they're not happy with job A, and then get job B in hand before they drop, their first job. Whereas men who are unmarried are more likely just to quit without any, sort of option in the wings, and then go try to find this other job. And of course, the first strategy is much more prudent than the second strategy. So it's one example of the way in which marriage is associated with a kind of prudence, a kind of responsibility on the part of young men. But it's also the case, too, that when we look at something like drinking, that right here, it's about a 20 percentage point difference for men, and only about a 12 percentage point difference for women. So this would be another example of where young men who are getting married are more likely to be kind of engaging in responsible behavior, and they're also, as a consequence, more likely to be happy. So the benefits I'm talking about are also applicable to men, but sort of the most powerful association when it comes to marital happiness are for women.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello. My name is Todd Goodsell. I'm in the Department of Sociology. I have a question about how we conceptualize singlehood.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure myself about how to conceptualize it, but I noticed in your presentation you were using a lot of language that suggests agency on the part of the individual single.
Yeah.
You use language like wait, delay, forego in relation to what singles are doing with marriage.
Yeah.
And I've wondered if that is always the case, or even if it is the case, if maybe the singles don't think themselves in those terms. They don't understand it as a choice that they're making. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Todd, because I'd certainly say for many of the folks who are foregoing marriage or who are getting married later, this can be involuntary, obviously. I would say really two things. One is that it is the case that for many Americans, it's harder to find decent, stable paying work, which may make them somewhat more reluctant to get married, or make them less attractive as a potential spouse in the eyes of their potential partners. So there's an economic reality here where the economy is less likely, particularly to give men decent jobs if they don't have a college education. And the jobs that are available are less likely to provide job security in ways that they would have 30 or 40 years ago. And that has some impact too on people's marital prospects. But the second big point I think that's worth making is that we don't have a kind of common courtship culture in our country that allows women and men to kind of signal in an easily comprehensible fashion that they are looking for a spouse and they're ready for marriage, and they'd like to kind of try to meet someone who would make for a good wife or good husband for them. And so that lack of a common courtship culture with common norms, common rules, common roles, can leave many folks, women and men, who would like to marry, sort of involuntarily single for either the duration of their lives or for a longer period than they might otherwise have chosen for themselves. So, I mean, in classic sort of sociological fashion, it's important to acknowledge that there's agency out there. And some people are deliberately choosing, as was the case initially for Jessica in the story from Laura Gottlieb's book, and seems to be as the case too for Kate Bullock in her essay in The Atlantic. They're choosing either over the course of their lives or at a certain point in their lives to steer clear of marriage. And that can lead them either just to postpone marriage or to end up single for their entire lives. But for other people, there is a sincere desire to get married, and either for economic reasons or other reasons, or because we live in a culture where there's not a common courtship culture that sort of facilitates good, good marriages. It can be hard for them to achieve their desired goal of getting married. Thanks, Tom.
I was intrigued by the final sentence on the last slide. You made the observation that if you're in a good relationship, in our culture we would probably finish that by saying, then you ought to be thinking about marriage. But you added a caveat. If you're in a good relationship and your friends and family are enthusiastic about the character of your beloved, you ought to be thinking about marriage. I'm curious why you underlined and stressed character rather than maybe some other parameters as one question. The second question is, can you share anything with us about the value of parental consent to subsequent marriage success?
Yeah, so what I think can happen, at least in some contexts in our culture, is that people are focused on appearance and personality. Is someone handsome or beautiful? Is someone funny or I don't know, maybe or just warm in general. They have a pleasant personality. And I'm not saying those things are unimportant, but it's, actually, I'm not very funny. And my wife, after the day after we got engaged, she said that her biggest concern getting married to me was that I wasn't very funny. But I had other characteristics that she obviously appreciated, thankfully. But my point here is that there are things like loyalty, fidelity, charity, fortitude, these kinds of virtues that we associate with character. That of course are much more important for going the distance in a marriage and as a father and as a husband, as a mother, than having the best sense of comedic timing, or being the most handsome or the or the prettiest person in the room. And I think people who are younger may succumb to the temptation to focus on personality or appearance, and if they get some good advice from friends and family, they'll recognize that, over the long haul, when you're old and wrinkled, sitting on the front porch of your house somewhere, at age 75, it's that character, and those common, values and interests that will obviously, be of greatest value to you, not some of the ephemera that we would associate with physical appearance, or with, some personality traits. So that's why I wanted to add that point about sort of character, and making the point too that oftentimes friends and family members who are not, obviously there's a physical dimension to all this, and when you first meet someone or get to know someone, there can be a very strong literally chemical connection between people. When I was at the University of Virginia, for instance, I lived in a community on the Quad, and we had the head of the college Republicans and a young woman who was a journalist, I think, for a kind of a progressive paper at the university. And they hit it off, but their connection was completely driven by chemistry. They had nothing in common with one another. And of course, over the course of a few months, they parted ways. So it's important for people who have got maybe some more perspective than you might as a young person to sort of weigh into it and sort of say, well, yeah, this person seems like a good potential, husband or a good potential wife for you, because they may have a better eye for their character as opposed to just sort of, their appearance or their personality. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, sir.
Hello, Jonathan Pike. I wanted to ask you two questions. One had to do with you just commenting on, instead of some of the microeconomic benefits of marriage, the macroeconomic benefits of marriage, and then also just as a follow-up on that, common courtship culture, and what, in your opinion, that would look like.
In terms of the macroeconomic benefits of marriage, I haven't seen anything on this. I'd like to see some work on it. I have a colleague who's looked at patterns of unionization at the state level, and we could take that kind of methodological approach and look at how patterns in family structure at the state level are associated with patterns of economic growth. But I haven't seen anything on that. My assumption, of course, is that because at the micro level we know that men are more likely to be productively engaged in the labor force, my assumption is that populations with higher percentages of married folks, particularly married men, will be more likely to enjoy at the macro level growth. But I haven't seen any good empirical research on that question. Okay.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, there's a great book, Family and Civilization, that was written in the 1940s by Carl Zimmerman, a Harvard professor, who he does talk about kind of the macro approach in this relation to the Western tradition, mainly Rome, and that's one word.
Right. So there are certainly people who are sort of reflecting historically on the connections, but in terms of seeing some pretty rigorous, empirically grounded research, I haven't seen anything on that front. On the issue of courtship, I think it's, I think what the key idea that I'd want to get across is that it looks like, based upon some work that's been done by people like Jason Carroll at BYU and Sharon Sassler at Cornell, that people who proceed, and also Scott Stanley at the University of Denver, that people who proceed relatively slowly in their relationship are more likely to flourish over the long term. And that's because they're sort of basically scaffolding, intimacy in a way that allows a certain measure of trust and communication and commitment to kind of develop in a reasonable fashion. And they're not kind of giving away their their heart right from the get-go, or their body right from the get-go. And so when they kind of scaffold it in a sort of more slow and, in a sense, deliberate fashion, that seems to allow them to develop the best form of romantic attachment, or I think that would be the term that Stanley would use. So I think the challenge for a kind of a new courtship culture is, how do we kind of scaffold intimacy for young couples who are looking towards marriage, both in terms of allowing them to see that this actually is a good relationship and that should lead to marriage, and also gives them enough freedom to realize, wait a second, this person, is not meant for me, at least, and gives them kind of an off-ramp to detach themselves, from the relationship. I don't have a 10-point plan for reviving courtship in America, or even courtship in some subcultures in America. But I think my bigger meta point here is that what we need is something that will allow us, to sort of scaffold intimacy in the right way, but also to build in off-ramps, so that people, either individuals or couples, realize that they're really not meant to marry one another. They don't have those common values or commitments, or even common interests, even if they share the same values, or their personality types don't seem to, really go hand in glove. Then, they'd have a fairly straightforward way of kind of signaling that to one another and to their network of friends and family as well.
Thank you. And another follow-up with that is just when it comes to just before the courtship, meaning a culture that engenders courtships.
Yeah.
That would be, I'm wondering, we have dances in our history, or other things like that. A culture that has people be able to get together that says, I'm here because I'm interested in having relationships or interacting with the opposite sex for the purpose of getting into relationships. And I don't know if you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have social functions that allow people to signal their interest and availability when it comes to marriage, but also we need sort of opportunities for young adults to see whether or not, the person that they're seeing has character. So you need opportunities, and of course one can be over, dinner and a movie or at a dance. Someone can be, attractive and pleasant. But you also need opportunities too where you can really learn about one another and have your friends and family learn about, the person that you're dating or that you're courting. I think any kind of courtship culture would need to have both opportunities to sort of signal your interest in sort of, finding someone to marry, but also to allow people to learn a fair bit about the other person, before they go ahead and get married.
Not exactly the drinking culture then, right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yep. Yeah.
Hi. Not that the dating and courtship culture of the past was perfect,
Right.
but I think that it has changed significantly since our parents were dating and our grandparents. Why do you think that it has changed? That might be a really broad question that's too involved, but yeah.
That's a good question. I think, and it goes partly to the points I was making to Todd earlier. I think, so partly, part of the story here is that teens and 20-somethings have fewer economic opportunities to kind of become stably established, which makes them more hesitant to go ahead and get married, and then act also in a way that's sort of marriage-minded. So Jason Carroll here at BYU, I think, and others that he's worked with have talked about kind of a marriage mentality. So it's not just sort of getting married, but kind of being ready to get married makes people kind of more serious about life in general, but also about their relationships in particular. So part of it's just about the sort of shifting economic foundations of our society. Part of it's too about a kind of more, individualistic culture that's come to the fore since the 70s. People are more likely to kind of want to articulate and feel and be independent. And that includes, of course, women like Kate Bullock in that Atlantic article that I was referencing. So that's part of the story here as well. Of course, if you're aspiring towards independence, it's hard to establish a kind of interdependent approach to both relationships and then more fundamentally to getting married. A third thing I think that's really important here is the sexual revolution of the late 60s and 70s, which basically made sex much more casual. And I think a certain portion of the population, became more likely to treat relationships in a casual manner because of the sexual revolution. This sort of came home to me when I was giving a talk at University of Georgia Law School, and I was talking to a young man, probably in his late 20s, and he was cohabiting with his girlfriend. And I said to him, well, if you couldn't have sex with her, would you marry her? You say, oh yeah. Okay, so this is just a concrete example of the way in which the sort of sexual revolution has sort of changed the experience of relationships and of sort of marriage for many young adults. So those would be three things that I would say in terms of three factors, that have helped to, undercut the, kind of a more courtship-oriented culture for young adults in the United States.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
In your presentation, you noted that the age of first childbirth has, we've had that crossover with age of first marriage. Have we seen any trends with, like, say, age at first cohabitation, perhaps? Or, for example, are we seeing that people still tend to cohabit around the same time that maybe our parents were getting married around that same age?
Yeah, no, one of the striking things in the report is that basically the timing of first co-residence in the United States hasn't changed much in the last 30 or 40 years, okay? So even though people are postponing marriage, they're not postponing that first, live-in experience, if you will. It's just happening for more Americans as a cohabitation versus a marriage, yeah. So that is that's a pretty profound difference. And of course, one of the problems with this new approach is that Americans who don't have college degrees are really not postponing their first child much at all. So, they're postponing marriage, but not the baby carriage, and that's why we see for Americans who don't have a college degree, a majority of them are having their first child outside of wedlock. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Questions? Okay. So one more question, and then we'll.
My question deals with, you talked about the article by Kate Bullock.
Yes.
And in it, she argues that there are less good men to marry. What would be your comment on that? Would you say that there are, the societal expectations of men have shifted, or would you say that women's views have shifted?
Well, yeah, I think it's both. I mean, I think that I think it is true in some way that that there are fewer good men today to marry, but that's partly a consequence of the fact that we're not demanding as much of our young men as we might have in a previous era. And it's also because women are not demanding as much of men as they did in a previous era as well. So, I think both the culture, the economy, and kind of what some would call a kind of the romantic marketplace or the the potential marriage marketplace is not one that demands a lot of today's young men, by and large. And so it's no surprise that a certain proportion of them are kind of not rising to the occasion to be responsible and potentially good, good suitors and good husbands. So I grant her complaint about the state of at least some men in our culture, but what I don't think she adequately appreciates is the extent to which the low standards that women set for men, including evidently from her own article that she sets for the men that she's been with, also are, implicated in, if you don't expect much of women or men, in whatever domain you're talking about here in the relationship domain, some of those guys they're not going to rise to the occasion because they're not really being asked to rise to the occasion. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great.